Human treated an alien girl without ceremony, and she realized it was the freedom she'd wanted. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Princess Lyra stood tall in the grand halls of her family's palace, her crimson-red skin glowing under the soft lights that shimmered from the intricate crystal chandeliers above. The palace was a place of immense power, a reflection of her royal status within the Tan Dominion. She was a ruler in her own right, admired and feared by those who served her. Yet, despite the opulence that surrounded her, she felt a strange emptiness inside. For all the adoration and respect she received, it was never real. It was all a facade, a performance meant to keep up appearances. No one ever treated her like a person, just as a symbol of power. Her every move was watched, her every word measured, and her actions dictated by the expectations of the court. She longed for something more than this life of hollow respect. She longed for freedom, for the ability to make choices without the burden of her title, but most of all, she longed for genuine connection. That day, she was introduced to someone who would change everything, someone she did not expect. His name was John Walker, a human. He was an ordinary man, far removed from the luxurious world she had known. He wasn't a noble, not a scholar, nor a diplomat, just a simple human, hired to serve as a bodyguard for her security during her visit to Earth. Lyra expected him to bow before her, to address her with the formalities that were second nature to those around her. But when he stepped into the room, his eyes met hers without a hint of reverence. He didn't show the usual awe that most did when in her presence. He didn't treat her like royalty. He didn't treat her like she was untouchable. Instead, he treated her like a regular person, as if she were just another human being, nothing more, nothing less. His indifference to her status caught her off guard. It was the first time in years that she felt like an individual rather than a queen. At first, she found this lack of formality strange, even somewhat rude. But as the day wore on, she found herself intrigued by him. There was no pretension in his manner, no attempt to flatter or bow. He was direct and honest, speaking to her with the same straightforwardness he would anyone else. It was a refreshing change from the sycophants who filled her court, always trying to gain her favor for their own benefit. As they spent more time together, Lyra began to see something different in John. His calm confidence, his ability to see her as just a person, made her feel something she had long forgotten: freedom. For the first time in her life, she wasn't defined by her title, her kingdom, or her expectations. She was simply Lyra. The more they talked, the more she realized that the freedom she had been craving wasn't something she could attain through power or position. It was something far more personal. It was the ability to be seen as who she truly was, without the weight of her crown hanging over her head. John's treatment of her, his lack of ceremony, was the very freedom she had been yearning for. And in that moment, she understood that it wasn't power or wealth that could bring her peace. It was the simplicity of being treated as an equal, a person deserving of respect, not because of her title, but because of who she truly was. As the days passed, Lyra found herself spending more time with John. The more they interacted, the more she began to appreciate his straightforwardness, something she had never encountered before. In the halls of her palace, she was used to people speaking in carefully chosen words, always considering the right way to address her, the proper way to show respect. But with John, there were no pretenses. He was always honest, always direct, and it was like a breath of fresh air. He treated her with kindness, yes, but also with an underlying respect that didn't require her to put on a mask or play the role of a queen. There was something deeply liberating about this. Lyra had always been surrounded by sycophants and political advisors, all too eager to please her, to climb the social ladder by gaining her favor. But John did none of that. He wasn't trying to win her over or seek anything in return. His motives were clear and simple. He was there to do a job, to protect her, and he did it with a quiet confidence. At first, Lyra thought it was just because he was a human. Maybe humans, she thought, didn't understand the delicate balance of power and respect that governed her world. But as they spent more time together, she realized it was more than that. It was his character. John was someone who valued equality, who didn't see her as a queen first, but as a person. In a moment of quiet reflection, Lyra caught herself smiling as she watched him from across the room. He was speaking to one of her attendants, and although the attendant was bowing and addressing him with the usual reverence, John remained calm and collected, completely unaffected by the display. He spoke with the attendant as if they were equals, and that made something inside Lyra stir. For once, she felt seen, not as a monarch or a figurehead, but as a person. As they continued their journey together, Lyra realized how much she had longed for this feeling. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her title, weighed down by the expectations of her people and her court. But now, with John, she was free. Free to laugh, without worrying about the political implications. Free to be herself, without the constant need for control. It was a freedom she had never known. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, the cool evening air drifting through the flowers, Lyra felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. John was telling her a story about his home planet, Earth, and despite herself, she found herself laughing. The sound felt foreign to her ears, but it was pure and genuine. She hadn't laughed like that in so long. It felt good. She realized that the life she had been living, the life of a queen, surrounded by luxury but lacking true connection, wasn't enough anymore. She wanted more than wealth and power. She wanted freedom. And in John, she saw the kind of freedom that could come from living without the constraints of titles and expectations. As they continued their conversation, Lyra found herself opening up to him, telling him about her past, about the weight of her responsibilities, and about the loneliness that often accompanied her royal position. John listened without judgment, offering words of comfort when needed, but never trying to fix her problems. His presence was enough. It was more than she had ever expected from anyone. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like Lyra. And that was the most freeing feeling of all. As the days went by, Lyra began to feel the weight of her newfound freedom more and more. It was strange at first, like stepping into a world she had never known. She had always been surrounded by people who catered to her every need. People who served her because of her position, not because of who she truly was. But with John, it was different. She was treated with respect, not because of her title, but because he saw her for who she really was. There were moments when they would sit together in silence, and Lyra realized how comfortable it felt. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to put on a facade. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate titles. It was just her and John, two people sharing a quiet moment. One evening, as they sat in the palace garden, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the path, Lyra looked at John. She had never really looked at him before, not like this. She had always seen him as just a human bodyguard, someone who was there to do his job. But now, she saw him as more than that. She saw his kindness, his patience, and the way he treated everyone with such decency. It was something that had always been missing in her life. She had never been treated as an equal by anyone in her world. Everyone had always bowed down to her, spoken in hushed tones around her, but no one had ever spoken to her as if she were just another person. Until John. You know, Lyra said, breaking the silence, I never really realized how lonely it is to be at the top. John looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to say something like that. What do you mean? He asked. Lyra hesitated for a moment before answering. Being a queen. It's not what people think. People think you have everything you could ever want, but they don't see the pressure, the expectations, the constant feeling of being watched, judged. It's like I'm not allowed to just be me. I'm always performing, always playing a part. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get it, he said quietly. I've never been in your position, but I know what it's like to feel like you have to live up to other people's expectations. Lyra turned to look at him, surprised by his understanding. She had expected him to say something more detached, something impersonal. But instead, he had said something that made her feel like he truly understood what she was going through. It's strange, she continued, but being around you, I don't feel like I have to pretend. I don't feel like I'm always on, like I have to live up to some ideal. John smiled slightly, his eyes softening. You don't have to pretend with me. I've never asked you to be anything other than yourself. Those words, simple as they were, hit Lyra in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life being seen as an object of power, of reverence. But with John, she was just a person, nothing more. And for the first time, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, their bond grew stronger. Lyra found herself sharing things she had never shared with anyone. Her hopes, her fears, her dreams for the future. And John listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. She began to realize that the freedom she had been searching for wasn't just about escaping her royal duties or responsibilities. It was about finding someone who could see her for who she truly was, and who would accept her without question. As their friendship deepened, so did the feelings Lyra had started to develop for John. It wasn't something she had planned, or even expected, but it was undeniable. She felt a pull toward him, a connection that went beyond anything she had experienced before. And though she wasn't sure what it all meant, she knew one thing for certain. Being with John had given her the freedom she had always longed for, the freedom to just be herself. As time passed, Lyra found herself in uncharted territory. The feelings that had started as a simple appreciation for John's honesty and his way of treating her had grown into something more. She could no longer deny it. She was drawn to him, not because of his position or his status, but because of who he was as a person. His unwavering respect, his quiet strength, and the way he made her feel truly seen. Those were the things that mattered now. She had spent her entire life in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth, power, and adoration, but none of it had ever made her feel the way John did. In his presence, she was no longer a queen, a figurehead, or a symbol. She was just Lyra, the real Lyra, the one who had always been hidden behind the walls of her royal duties. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens, Lyra noticed how different everything felt now. The air seemed fresher, the flowers more vibrant. Even the moonlight seemed to shine brighter. She was no longer trapped by the expectations of her position, and it felt like the world was finally opening up to her. John was beside her, as always, offering his steady presence. "John," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I would feel like this. I never thought I could be free." He turned to her, his expression gentle. "You are free, Lyra. You've always been free. You just didn't realize it until now." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had always thought that freedom meant escaping her responsibilities, running away from her duties as a queen. But John had made her see that freedom was something deeper. It was about choosing who she wanted to be and allowing herself to live without the chains of her title. "But what if I don't want to go back?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. She knew what her responsibilities were, but the thought of returning to her life of endless rules and expectations felt suffocating. "Then don't," John replied simply. "You don't have to go back. You can choose your own path." His words were like a lifeline, offering her a choice she had never considered before. She had always believed that her life was dictated by her title, by the needs of her people. But John had shown her that she had the power to choose something different, something for herself. Lyra paused, looking up at the stars above. She had spent so long looking at the world through the lens of duty, never considering that she could have her own desires, her own dreams. She could live for herself, without the weight of her crown. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even her. "I've always been the queen. I don't know how to be anything else." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "You don't have to be anything else. Just be you, Lyra. That's enough." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, gave her more comfort than she had ever felt in her entire life. It wasn't about being a queen or a servant or a figurehead. It was about being herself. And in that moment, Lyra knew that she had the power to shape her own future, free from the constraints of her past. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to face it, not as a queen, but as Lyra, the woman who had found her freedom. The days that followed felt like a dream to Lyra. For the first time in her life, she was free. The weight of her title, the endless expectations, the constant pressure of being a queen, they were all fading into the background. She spent more time with John, enjoying the simplicity of their conversations, the quiet moments that had once been so foreign to her. It felt like a new world, one she was slowly discovering for herself. She had never known that freedom could feel so light, so easy. Yet, with each passing day, the more she felt herself changing. Her mind wandered often to her people, her kingdom. She knew there were duties she couldn't completely abandon, but now, she saw them through a different lens. They were important, yes, but they no longer defined her. Her life was no longer a script she had to follow, and that realization filled her with peace. John never pushed her, never tried to convince her to make decisions one way or another. He simply stood by her, offering support when she needed it, space when she didn't. One evening, as the sky turned dark, and the stars began to twinkle above, Lyra found herself alone with her thoughts. John had stepped away for a while, giving her the time she needed to process everything. She thought about her father, about the years of isolation and responsibility. She thought about her people, how they had looked up to her, how they still needed her. The realization hit her like a wave. She could still be their leader, but she could lead on her own terms, without the suffocating weight of her crown. The pressure to always be perfect, to always have the answers, had been lifted. Lyra took a deep breath, the cool air calming her restless mind. She was no longer afraid. She had found a new purpose, one that wasn't tied to her title or her lineage. It was tied to who she had become, to the person she had discovered in herself through her time with John. She was still the same Lyra, but she was stronger, freer, and more in control of her own destiny. As she stood up, feeling the gentle pull of the night air around her, she knew it was time to move forward. She had decisions to make, but they would be her decisions. There was no rush. She was no longer constrained by a life she had not chosen. The future felt full of possibilities, and for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. John returned after a while, his presence as steady and comforting as always. He didn't say much at first, simply joining her as they stood side by side, watching the stars. There was a quiet understanding between them, a connection that had formed without words. Lyra turned to him, her heart full. "Thank you," she said softly. John looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice gentle. "I'm just glad I could be here with you." His words resonated deeply within her. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was about the simple, steady presence he offered, about the way he had always treated her as an equal, as a person, not a queen. For the first time in her life, Lyra understood what true freedom was. It wasn't escaping her responsibilities. It wasn't running away from her title. It was the ability to choose, to live for herself without fear, and to know that she was worthy of that choice. And with that realization, she knew she was ready to step into whatever came next, not as a queen, but as Lyra, the woman who had found her own way. As Lyra continued to settle into her new life, she realized that change wasn't just about escaping her old responsibilities. It was about finding a balance between who she had been and who she wanted to be. She still cared deeply for her people, the Tan, but now, her role felt less like an obligation and more like a choice. With John's quiet support, Lyra had discovered a new sense of independence, a new sense of purpose. Her days were no longer dictated by the strict routines and endless ceremonies of royalty. Instead, she was learning how to navigate life with more freedom, more authenticity. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant hills, Lyra took a walk through the palace grounds. The golden light cast long shadows, and the air was crisp with the promise of a new day. She had spent most of the previous day meeting with advisors, discussing matters of the kingdom. It was important, but today, she felt the need to be alone. She needed to reflect, to understand her place in the world. John had accompanied her to the palace gardens earlier, as he often did, but today, he had left her to her own thoughts, understanding that sometimes she just needed space. As she walked, Lyra thought about her past, about the moments she had spent in the throne room, the pressure she had felt to always do the right thing, to always have the answers. She thought about the loneliness that had come with the crown, the isolation that had haunted her even in the presence of others. She had never truly felt like she belonged. Now, however, she felt different. She felt like she was starting to find her place. It wasn't about ruling with fear or expectations. It was about leading with understanding, with compassion, and with the realization that she was not alone. Lyra paused by a small pond, gazing at her reflection in the still water. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the queen who had been forced to wear a mask of perfection. In her place was someone new, someone who had finally allowed herself to be vulnerable, to be real. She smiled at her reflection, a soft, genuine smile. It felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. In that moment, Lyra realized she had spent so many years trying to meet the expectations of others that she had forgotten to ask herself what she wanted. What did she truly want? As she stood there, contemplating her next steps, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind her. Turning around, she saw John walking toward her. He was always calm, always steady, and today was no different. There was a quiet comfort in his presence, a reassurance that she was not alone. "Mind if I join you?" he asked with a small, knowing smile. Lyra nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Of course not," she replied. Together, they sat by the pond, the peaceful sounds of nature surrounding them. For a while, they simply enjoyed the silence, neither of them feeling the need to fill the quiet with words. It was a rare kind of peace, one that Lyra had never experienced before. It was as if the world had slowed down just for them. After a while, Lyra turned to John, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed everything for me, you know," she said quietly. John looked at her, his gaze steady and sincere. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. "You did it all. You just needed to see that you had the power to make your own choices." Lyra smiled again, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. She had always been told what to do, how to act, and who to be. But now, she was learning to choose for herself. "Maybe," she said, "but you were the one who showed me that it was possible." For the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she was truly in control. Not of her kingdom, not of her title, but of herself. And that was more powerful than anything she had ever known. As the weeks passed, Lyra's life began to take on a rhythm that felt both new and comforting. Her days no longer revolved around the endless formalities of royal life. Instead, she spent her time in ways that nourished her soul, talking with John, walking through the palace, gardens, and, most importantly, contemplating her future. The quiet moments they shared were invaluable. They spoke of everything and nothing, exchanging thoughts about the world, their lives, and even the simplest pleasures they had once taken for granted. Lyra had spent so much time as a queen, burdened by her title and the expectations it carried, that she had forgotten the joy of just living, of existing without the constant pressure to perform. Now, she was learning to embrace that freedom. John had been her rock, always steady, always there when she needed him. His unwavering support had given her the courage to see herself as more than just a ruler, more than a symbol of power. She was a woman, with hopes, fears, and desires just like anyone else. It was a realization that had taken time, but now it felt like the truth of who she was. One afternoon, while strolling through the palace courtyard, Lyra found herself lost in thought once again. She had always known that, as a queen, her life would be full of responsibility. But she never imagined that responsibility could coexist with the kind of life she now found herself embracing. As she walked, John appeared beside her, his calm presence as reassuring as always. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice gentle. Lyra smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "I've just been thinking," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "About everything, about what comes next." John looked at her, his expression warm but curious. "And what has come next?" he asked. Lyra paused for a moment, letting the question settle within her. She had spent so much of her life being told what to do, guided by the duties of her station. But now, she was the one deciding. I think I want to do more than just rule," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to be more than just a queen. I want to make a difference. I want to help my people, but not in the way I thought I had to." John nodded, as if he had already understood. "You don't have to be defined by your crown, Lyra. You've already made a difference by being true to yourself." His words resonated deeply within her. For the first time, she realized that her true power did not lie in her title, her wealth, or her position. It lay in her ability to choose her path, to live with authenticity, and to inspire those around her through her actions. "I want to create change," Lyra continued, her voice filled with newfound determination. "I want to help my people in a way that brings us all together, without the walls of hierarchy or expectation. We've been divided for too long, and I want to break down those walls." John's gaze softened, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You already are, Lyra," he said. The way you've changed, the way you see the world, it's inspiring. And that's more powerful than any crown. Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had been so focused on her duty, on the weight of her responsibilities, that she had forgotten the impact of her own transformation. She had already begun to make a difference, not by following tradition, but by being true to who she was. And in that truth, she had found the freedom she had always sought. As they continued their walk, the warmth of the sun on her skin, Lyra felt a sense of clarity. Her future was hers to shape, and she would do so with compassion, authenticity, and the unwavering belief that true leadership came not from power, but from the ability to empower others. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she was ready to face it, not as a queen burdened by the expectations of others, but as Lyra, a woman who had found her own path. As Lyra's days continued in this newfound freedom, her perspective on life began to shift even further. She had once thought her role as queen defined everything she was. But now, it was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. She wasn't just a ruler of a kingdom. She was a person capable of forging her own destiny. It was a reality she had never allowed herself to see. Walking alongside John, talking with him, and simply existing in his presence gave her a kind of peace that had always eluded her. She could feel the weight of the crown and her duties, but it no longer consumed her. It was simply a part of her life, not the whole of it. One afternoon, as Lyra gazed out over the palace grounds, she found herself reflecting on her choices. It wasn't just the palace or the people she ruled. It was about how she wanted to use her position to create change. The responsibilities of a queen were not a burden, but a privilege, and she now saw them through a different lens. She had been given an incredible opportunity to help her people, and that was something she could not ignore. But she didn't have to be trapped by tradition or expectation. Lyra realized that she could make the kind of change she had always wanted, not by following the paths laid before her, but by forging her own. John had shown her that it was possible to lead with compassion, to make decisions based on who she was as a person, not just as a monarch. She turned to him, a sense of purpose settling in her heart. "John," she began, her voice steady, "I've been thinking about how I want to move forward. It's not just about ruling. It's about leading in a way that truly helps my people, that brings them together. I want to create a kingdom where everyone has a voice, no matter their station." John's eyes softened as he looked at her. He had always known that Lyra was capable of greatness, but now he saw her embracing it in a way that was uniquely her own. "I think that's exactly what they need," he said quietly. "A queen who listens, who understands, and who leads with heart. You've already started that, Lyra. You don't have to wait for the perfect moment. The change can begin now, with you." His words filled her with a quiet confidence. It was true. She had already begun the transformation, not just within herself, but in the way she approached her role as a leader. She didn't have to wait for some grand event or approval from others. The change she sought could begin in small ways, in the everyday actions she took. "Thank you," she said softly, her gratitude evident in her tone. John's steady presence had been a guiding force, and for that, she was truly thankful. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the gardens, Lyra felt a deep sense of peace. She had once believed that her worth was tied to her title, to the power she held. But now, she understood that her true worth lay in her ability to lead with compassion, to make decisions that were true to who she was. She had the freedom to shape her future, and with that freedom came the responsibility to create a better world, one where her people could thrive, not out of fear, but out of trust and mutual respect. And with John by her side, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next, not as a queen above her people, but as Lyra, a woman who had found her place in the world and was ready to help others find theirs. Lyra stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the horizon as the first light of dawn bathed the landscape in soft hues of pink and gold. The air was still, the kind of quiet that settled deep into her bones. For so long, she had been trapped by the weight of expectations, by the walls of her title. But now, everything was different. Now, she was finally free to live on her own terms. The change she had begun to embrace was not just about stepping away from her duties. It was about rediscovering herself and her purpose. She no longer saw her role as queen as a burden to bear, but as a platform from which she could truly make a difference. She could create a kingdom where people were not divided by their status, where they were united by their shared humanity. It was a vision that had once seemed impossible, but now it felt within reach. The road ahead would not be without its challenges. Change, especially on such a grand scale, would take time. But Lyra was no longer afraid of the hard work it would require. She had faced the hardest battle already, overcoming the limitations she had placed on herself. Now, with a clear mind and an open heart, she was ready to lead in a way that would inspire others to do the same. As she stood there, deep in thought, she felt a familiar presence beside her. John had arrived quietly, as he always did, standing just a few steps behind her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Lyra said, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "It really is," John replied, his voice steady, comforting. He stepped closer, standing beside her as they both took in the view. There was no need for words, just the shared understanding between them. He had been with her every step of the way, supporting her as she discovered her true self. "I've been thinking," Lyra continued, turning to him with a thoughtful look on her face. "I've spent my whole life believing that I had to be something I wasn't. I thought I had to be perfect, to live up to some ideal of what a queen should be. But now, I realize that the only thing I need to be is myself. I can lead with kindness, with integrity, and with a vision that brings us all together." John nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "I've always known you had it in you, Lyra. You've already started to change everything, not with force, but with your heart." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. John's words meant more to her than she could express. He had been a constant source of strength and wisdom. And now, together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Lyra wasn't afraid. She knew she had the power to shape it, not just as a queen, but as a person, someone who led with love, empathy, and understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." John looked at her with a quiet smile. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm just here, with you, because I believe in you." Lyra looked out at the horizon again, a sense of peace settling over her. The world was full of endless possibilities, and she was ready to embrace them all. As she stood there, with John by her side, Lyra felt the weight of her past slip away. She was no longer defined by the crown she wore, but by the person she had become, and that was all she needed.